So I want you to picture this. You get in your car right now, you merge onto the highway, you hit 65 miles an hour, and then you magically point the nose of your vehicle straight up into the sky.
That would be quite the commute.
Right. But think about it. If you keep driving straight up at highway speeds, in less than an hour, you are no longer just driving. You are inside a physically contested warfighting domain.
Exactly. At exactly 100 kilometers above our heads, the atmosphere effectively ends.
And the space domain begins.
Yeah.
I mean, it isn't some science fiction backdrop with, warp drives and distant galaxies. It is a present-day battleground.
It really is.
Everything from your smartphone's map application to the targeting systems of modern military hardware relies completely on whoever controls that invisible high ground.
Which is exactly why we are digging into this today.
Yes. So welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are grounding our entire conversation in two foundational sources. We have the United States Army Space Reference Text for the year 2026, and we have Joint Publication 314, Joint Space Operations.
And if you read through those, especially the United States Army Space Reference Text, the first thing that hits you is how much the domain has fundamentally changed.
Right, because I think people still view space as this pristine, peaceful vacuum where we just, casually park satellites to look at the stars or beam down television signals.
Yeah, that era is completely over. It used to be a benign environment, sure, but now it is absolutely critical to unified action across all domains of warfare. Land, sea, air, cyber, they all depend on space.
So that 1 hour drive straight up radically changes the fundamental laws of physics you have to operate under, right?
Yeah.
Which I imagine dictates an entirely different doctrine for military operations.
It changes everything. The organizational architecture the United States has built to secure national interests in space, from space and to space, is massively complex.
Well, before we can even begin to understand the organizations trying to control this domain, we really have to establish what this domain actually is.
Good point. Where does it start?
The Unified Command Plan, which delegates geographic and functional responsibilities across the military, legally defines the space domain as everywhere 100 kilometers or greater above the surface of the Earth.
Right, the Karmin line.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it's not like the atmosphere just hits a brick wall at 100 kilometers, right? Like there's no physical signpost up there.
No, not at all. It slowly tapers off into a vacuum. The reason we use that specific altitude, the Karmin line, is because it marks the physical boundary where aerodynamics essentially fail.
So below 100 kilometers, an aircraft stays in the sky because air molecules are rushing over its wings to create lift.
Right, fluid dynamics. But above that line, the air is just too thin. You can't fly a plane up there. To avoid falling back to Earth, an object has to achieve orbital mechanics.
Okay, break that down for us, because the physics of orbital mechanics are, well, entirely divorced from how we fight in the air.
They really are. So to stay in low Earth orbit, a satellite must travel at roughly 17,000 miles per hour.
17,000. That's just a number so large it's hard to even visualize.
It's about 5 miles per second, and at that velocity, as gravity pulls the satellite downward, the actual curvature of the Earth falls away beneath it at the exact same rate.
Oh, so it's not really floating. It is in a perpetual state of free fall.
Exactly. It's falling, but it's moving sideways so fast that it keeps missing the ground.
That is why.
But that speed and that continuous trajectory mean you cannot simply stop a satellite, hover, or easily change direction the way a fighter jet does.
Right, because if a fighter jet sees a threat, the pilot just banks hard left and hits the afterburners.
Right, but maneuvering in space expends precious fuel, and once a satellite is out of fuel, its operational life is effectively over. It becomes space junk.
So this physical reality forces military planners to anticipate threats months or even years in advance.
Absolutely, because you cannot rapidly deploy a replacement satellite to a specific orbit in a matter of minutes. It takes immense planning.
Which naturally leads us to the reality that we are already operating in a spectrum of conflict up there.
We definitely are.
Joint Publication 314 lays out this framework called the competition continuum. And it breaks down global relations into three phases, right? Cooperation, competition, and armed conflict.
Yeah, and this is a huge paradigm shift. We tend to think of warfare as a light switch. We are either at peace or we are at war.
On or off.
Right. But the competition continuum argues that in the space domain, it is a constantly sliding scale.
So right now, in the cooperation and competition phases, space forces are executing operations every single day.
They are. They are establishing norms, tracking international space traffic, and deterring aggression. The competition phase is particularly volatile right now.
Because it's not just peaceful observation anymore. What are our adversaries actually doing?
Well, we see peer adversaries routinely conducting proximity operations.
What does that mean practically, like pulling up next to us?
Essentially, yes. Maneuvering their satellites unusually close to United States military satellites to test our reaction times, or to see how well our monitoring capabilities actually work.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and they are actively utilizing terrestrial lasers to temporarily blind our optical sensors.
Wait, really? Shooting lasers from the ground up at our satellites?
Yes, and employing localized electronic jamming against our communication networks. This is all happening below the threshold of declared war.
It's like a constant shadowboxing match in the vacuum of space.
Shadowboxing is the perfect way to describe it, but if deterrence fails, the continuum shifts to armed conflict.
And then the objective moves from simply monitoring and deterring to actively securing freedom of action.
Right. Which could require offensive orbital warfare to disrupt or destroy an adversary's capabilities before they can degrade ours.
And that shadowboxing is happening because the strategic value of the domain is just unparalleled. I mean, look back at Operation Desert Storm in 1991.
Oh, yeah. Many historians consider that the first space war.
Because the United States military realized that utilizing the space domain allowed them to outsee and outmaneuver the Iraqi forces with devastating efficiency. The Iraqi army thought they were safe in the featureless desert, but our forces used the global positioning system to navigate perfectly through a sandstorm.
Exactly. And think about the vantage point. A satellite in geosynchronous orbit, sitting 22,000 miles above the equator, has a field of view covering roughly 1/3 of the entire planet.
1/3 of the Earth from one satellite.
Yes.
Okay.
You can detect the heat plume of a ballistic missile launch within seconds. You can route encrypted communications across oceans instantly.
So basically, if you control the space domain, you control the tempo, the logistics, and the lethality of the forces on the ground.
You hold the ultimate high ground. But that strategic advantage forces a critical conversation about international law.
Which is always a sticky subject when we talk about space.
Very. The United States Army Space Reference Text explicitly references the Outer Space Treaty of 1967.
Right. A Cold War-era agreement designed to prevent a literal arms race in the stars.
The treaty expressly prohibits placing weapons of mass destruction, like nuclear warheads, in orbit or on celestial bodies like the moon.
Which is comforting, honestly.
Very comforting. Furthermore, it mandates that space be used for, quote, peaceful purposes.
But peaceful purposes does not equate to a demilitarized zone.
No, it does not. And that's a common misconception.
Well, it's very similar to maritime law, isn't it? Like, think about the high seas during the Age of Exploration. International waters are designated for peaceful transit and shared commerce. Anyone can sail a cargo ship across the Pacific Ocean.
Right.
But the fact that it is a shared peaceful domain does not mean the United States Navy simply docks all its destroyers and aircraft carriers and stays home.
Exactly. The military presence on the high seas ensures that the domain remains stable and that commerce is actually protected from piracy or hostile blockades.
So the legal precedent for space is identical.
It is. The Charter of the United Nations guarantees the inherent right of self-defense, and that right extends vertically into the space domain.
So protecting multi-billion-dollar satellite constellations, securing the lines of communication that the global economy relies on, and posturing to deny an adversary the use of space during a conflict, that is all entirely legal.
Completely legal and absolutely paramount to national security. We maintain a military posture in space to guarantee that the environment remains accessible for civilian use, commercial enterprise, and allied operations.
Okay, so if the stakes are this high, we really have to look at the organizations actually running this domain.
Yes, the architecture.
Because if you turn on the news, you hear different entities mentioned interchangeably, which creates a massive amount of public confusion.
Oh, absolutely. People mix them up constantly.
We need to clearly separate the United States Space Force from United States Space Command. They are not the same thing.
Not at all.
They do not have the same authorities, and they perform fundamentally different roles under the United States Code. So let's unpack this. Let's start with the United States Space Force.
Right, which was established in December of 2019.
As a distinct military service branch organized under the Department of the Air Force.
And the easiest parallel to draw here is the United States Marine Corps.
Oh, that's a great way to look at it.
Right. The Marine Corps is a distinct service branch, but it falls administratively under the Department of the Navy.
Okay.
So, as a military service, the United States Space Force operates under Title 10 of the United States Code with a very specific, limited mandate. Their job is to organize, to train, and to equip.
Organize, train, and equip. So they aren't the ones actually pulling the trigger, so to speak.
Correct. The Space Force is responsible for recruiting personnel, the Guardians, and putting them through specialized education.
Education tailored entirely to things like orbital mechanics, space systems, and cyber warfare.
Exactly. They're also responsible for the incredibly complex acquisition process. They work with defense contractors to design, build, and launch new satellites and ground radar systems.
Okay, so the Space Force creates the Guardians, builds the satellites, and writes the service-specific doctrine. But they don't actually conduct the warfighting.
Right. That authority belongs to United States Space Command.
So what is Space Command exactly?
Space Command is a unified combatant command. So while the Space Force builds the tools and trains the people, United States Space Command takes those tools, takes those Guardians, and actually executes the mission.
Got it. They plan the global operations. They integrate space power with the other combatant commands. And if we enter armed conflict, they are the ones executing the strategy.
The distinction between a service branch and a combatant command is the bedrock of modern military organization. When a Guardian finishes their training in the Space Force, they are essentially presented to United States Space Command to do their daily job.
Oh, I see.
The combatant commander exercises operational control over those forces to deter aggression and defend national interests.
Wait, I want to examine the friction that led to this exact organizational structure. Because prior to 2019, space operations were largely handled by Air Force Space Command, right?
Correct.
The United States Air Force was buying the satellites, training the space operators, and managing the domain. So creating an entirely new branch of the military requires massive bureaucratic overhead.
Oh, yeah. Huge.
You need new uniforms, new headquarters, new senior leadership positions. It's a huge lift. Why go through the painful process of splitting the Space Force out from the Air Force if United States Space Command is going to be doing the actual fighting anyway? Isn't that just adding layers of bureaucracy?
Well, it seems like it on the surface. But the split was driven by a fundamental clash of cultures and budgetary priorities.
A clash of cultures? How so?
Well, a military service naturally prioritizes its core identity. For the United States Air Force, that core identity is air superiority and the combat pilot.
Right. Fighter jets, bombers.
Exactly. Throughout the 2000s and 2010s, space was largely viewed as a utility within the Air Force. It was a supportive function meant to ensure that the planes could navigate and the precision-guided munitions could find their targets.
So space was just there to help the planes do their job better.
Precisely. And when federal budgets contracted, the Air Force leadership faced agonizing choices. Do we fund a new constellation of early warning satellites, or do we fund a new squadron of fifth-generation fighter jets?
And I'm guessing the fighter jets usually won that argument.
Almost every time. Because the culture prioritized the air domain, space acquisitions frequently lost out in the budget battles.
And while our space budget was being cannibalized to fund aircraft, our adversaries were not sitting idle.
No, they were watching us very closely.
They looked at how the United States fought in the Middle East and realized that our entire way of war is inextricably tethered to space.
Exactly. If you want to blind the United States military, you don't need to shoot down thousands of fighter jets.
You just need to disable a few dozen critical satellites.
Right, so our adversaries began aggressively developing anti-satellite missiles, co-orbital kinetic kill vehicles, and terrestrial jammers.
The threat environment evolved so rapidly that space could no longer be treated as a secondary priority.
It couldn't. We needed a cadre of professionals who woke up every single morning thinking about nothing but space superiority.
So establishing the United States Space Force guaranteed a ring-fenced budget that could not be rated for terrestrial aircraft.
That is the most critical piece. It created a culture entirely focused on the physics of space. And crucially, it placed a chief of space operations on the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Oh, so they finally got a seat at the big table.
Exactly. Ensuring that space requirements had a dedicated, equal voice at the highest levels of national security planning.
Okay, that makes total sense. Now that we have a United States Space Command functioning as the warfighting entity, we have to look at how they actually project power.
And this is where it gets geographically complicated.
Right. Because their area of responsibility begins at 100 kilometers and extends infinitely outward. That presents a bizarre geographical paradox.
It really does.
The commander of United States Space Command is responsible for the vacuum of space. But their physical headquarters, their data centers, and their personnel are entirely terrestrial. They operate from places like Colorado, relying heavily on ground-based infrastructure.
The paradox deepens when you consider how space effects are consumed. A multi-billion-dollar satellite providing the most advanced imagery in human history is completely useless if the data cannot reach the tactical edge.
Right. A satellite is just a hunk of metal if the soldier in the jungle can't see the picture it's taking.
Precisely. Space capabilities exist almost exclusively to generate effects within terrestrial domains. Therefore, United States Space Command cannot plan in a vacuum, pun intended.
Nice.
They must integrate seamlessly with every other combatant command on the planet.
And the mechanism they use to achieve that integration is the Joint Force Space Component Commander, who manages the overarching strategy.
Yes, at the operational level.
But at the tactical level, United States Space Command embeds personnel directly into other organizations using joint integrated space teams.
This is where the magic happens.
Let's look at how this plays out in reality. Imagine United States Indo-Pacific Command is planning a complex naval maneuver to secure an island chain. They have ships, submarines, and aircraft maneuvering across thousands of miles of open ocean.
A massive logistical undertaking.
Huge. But the space operators aren't just calling them on the phone from Colorado. The Joint Integrated Space Team is physically sitting in the headquarters in Hawaii with the naval and air planners.
Right. As the terrestrial planners map out the operation, the Joint Integrated Space Team translates their objectives into space requirements.
So the terrestrial commander might say, I need to know if the adversary moves their mobile anti-ship missile batteries on this specific island between 0200 and 0400 hours.
And the space team takes that requirement, determines which synthetic aperture radar satellites or optical satellites will be passing over that exact latitude and longitude during that precise time window.
And then they send a formal request back to United States Space Command to task those specific satellites.
Exactly. They bridge the gap between orbital mechanics and ground maneuvers. They make sure the terrestrial force gets the space support it needs when it needs it.
But United States Space Command is not just looking down at the Earth, right? If the area responsibility starts at 100 kilometers, where does it end? Does United States Space Command have authority over operations on the Moon or Mars?
Well, according to Joint Publication 314 and the United States Army Space Reference Text, the area of responsibility is expanding aggressively outward.
Because historically, military space operations have been confined largely between low Earth orbit and geosynchronous orbit.
Right, basically right around our planet. But the doctrine now explicitly addresses cislunar space.
Which is the vast volume of space between the Earth and the Moon.
Yes, and even heliocentric operations, which involve orbits around the sun.
Wait, really? The military is planning for operations around the sun?
It's part of the evolving doctrine, yes. But the immediate push is into cislunar space, and that is driven by physics, specifically gravity wells and Lagrange points.
Okay, Lagrange points. I've heard this term in sci-fi movies, but what is it actually?
Lagrange points are specific locations in space where the gravitational pull of the Earth and the Moon perfectly balance the centripetal force required for a spacecraft to move with them.
Oh, so it's like a gravitational parking spot.
That is exactly what it is. If you park a satellite at a Lagrange point, it stays there with minimal fuel consumption. These points offer ultimate high ground vantage points to monitor both the Earth and the far side of the Moon.
Which is becoming more important every day. As commercial enterprises and international civilian space agencies accelerate their plans for lunar resource extraction and permanent outposts, the lines of communication will stretch across cislunar space.
And commerce requires security. United States Space Command is actively developing the doctrine and the space domain awareness capabilities to monitor and protect those extended lines, ensuring freedom of navigation far beyond Earth's immediate orbit.
This brings us to a massive realization. Delivering effects across these vast distances and pulling that data down to terrestrial forces is not a unilateral effort by the Space Force.
Not at all.
It's like a massive symphony orchestra. The Space Force might make the instruments, Space Command conducts the music, but the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines are the musicians actually playing the notes on the ground, sea, and air.
I like that analogy. The space architecture is a deeply integrated joint effort involving every single military service. It requires immense synchronization.
The United States Space Force might be managing the satellites, but the other branches are both the primary consumers of the data and active defenders of the physical infrastructure.
Exactly. And to understand the joint nature of space operations, we really must start with the largest consumer of space capabilities in the Department of Defense.
Which is the United States Army.
Yes.
Which is crazy to think about. While the public associates the Army with armored columns, tanks, and infantry squads.
Yeah.
The reality is that a modern Army brigade combat team cannot effectively maneuver or coordinate fires without continuous access to space.
They would be fundamentally paralyzed.
Let's break down the mechanics of that reliance. The Army relies heavily on a capability called positioning, navigation, and timing.
PNT, as it's often abbreviated, though we're spelling things out today.
Right, positioning, navigation, and timing. The most famous system providing this capability is the Global Positioning System.
Now, we tend to think of the global positioning system simply as a digital map that tells us where we are. You look in your phone, you see the blue dot.
Yeah, exactly.
But the timing aspect is arguably the most critical piece of the triad. The global positioning system satellites do not actually know where your receiver is.
Wait, really? They don't track my phone?
No, not at all. They're essentially just flying atomic clocks.
Okay, you're going to have to explain that. How does a clock tell me I'm standing on the corner of Main Street?
So they broadcast a continuous radio signal. And that signal contains two things: their exact location in orbit and the exact time the signal was transmitted, down to the nanosecond.
Okay, down to that nanosecond.
Because radio waves travel at a constant speed, the speed of light, a receiver on an Army Humvee receives that signal and calculates exactly how long the signal took to arrive.
Oh, so if it knows when the signal left and when it arrived, it knows the distance.
Exactly. And by locking onto the signals of at least 4 different satellites, the receiver triangulates its precise position in 3-dimensional space.
That is incredibly clever.
But more importantly, the military uses that incredibly precise timing signal from the atomic clocks to synchronize other systems.
Like what?
Well, frequency-hopping tactical radios, for one. To keep adversaries from listening in, military radios change frequencies hundreds of times a second. Both radios have to know exactly what time it is to the microsecond to hop to the same frequency together.
Oh.
They also use the timing to timestamp encrypted data networks and to coordinate the detonation of precision artillery shells.
So if the Army loses that timing signal, their communication networks instantly begin to desynchronize.
Yes. They literally can't talk securely to each other, and their ability to execute unified land operations degrades severely.
And because the Army's reliance is so absolute, they maintain a massive organization called the United States Army Space and Missile Defense Command.
Right. They have their own internal space organization.
Their function is twofold. First, they manage the Army's terrestrial space assets, like mobile satellite communication terminals.
And second, they actively provide Army space professionals who integrate into corps and division staffs.
Just like those joint integrated space teams we talked about earlier.
Exactly. To help ground commanders maximize their use of space effects, they ensure the Army's specific requirements are represented when the joint force is designing new satellite constellations.
Right, like needing signals strong enough to penetrate dense, triple canopy jungles. The Space Force might not think of that, but the Army definitely does.
Precisely. And the maritime domain faces very similar dependencies.
Right. The United States Navy operates Navy Space Command, which is structurally aligned under Fleet Cyber Command. The ocean represents an unforgiving environment for communications.
Very unforgiving. A carrier strike group operating in the middle of the Philippine Sea has no access to fiber optic cables or cellular towers.
None.
Their ability to receive command updates, coordinate with airborne early warning aircraft, and track over-the-horizon threats relies almost entirely on satellite communications.
But the submarine fleet has an even more unique requirement.
Oh, submarines are fascinating when it comes to space.
Right, because a nuclear submarine's primary advantage is stealth. If it surfaces to raise a large satellite dish, it completely reveals its position.
It becomes a target instantly.
So the Navy utilizes highly specialized narrowband satellite communications. The submarine can trail a very thin wire antenna just below the surface of the water.
Because radio waves struggle to penetrate deep water.
Right, so it trails this wire just below the surface, and it can receive heavily encrypted, low-bandwidth text messages from space without ever breaking the surface or compromising its acoustic stealth.
It is brilliant engineering, and that specific requirement is managed and advocated for by Navy Space Command.
And the United States Marine Corps operates under a similar construct with Marine Corps Forces Space Command.
Right. Their primary mission is to provide tailored space effects to the Fleet Marine Force.
When Marines are conducting amphibious assaults or expeditionary advanced space operations on remote, austere islands, they require mobile, highly resilient space linkages for command and control. You can't just run a CADL across a beachhead.
Exactly. But the most fascinating joint contribution might actually come from the United States Air Force.
Oh, really? Even after they gave up most of their space professionals to the Space Force?
Yes. When the Space Force was created, the Air Force transitioned its satellite operators and orbital wargamers to the new branch. However, the Air Force remains an absolutely vital defender of the space domain.
Why?
Because of how space systems are physically constructed. A space capability relies on 3 segments. First, you have the space segment.
Which is the actual satellite in orbit.
Right. Second, you have the ground segment.
The command and control antennas and data centers down here on Earth.
Exactly. And third, you have the link segment.
Which is the invisible electromagnetic radio waves connecting the two.
Now, if an adversary wants to neutralize a satellite, launching an interceptor missile into orbit is incredibly expensive.
And highly escalatory. Not to mention it creates dangerous debris fields.
Right. A much simpler method is to attack the link segment or the ground segment.
Okay, so how do they do that?
An adversary can deploy a truck-mounted terrestrial jammer designed to overpower the satellite's downward signal, essentially deafening the receivers on the ground.
Oh, so they just scream over the radio frequency so the receiver can't hear the satellite.
Exactly. When that happens, the United States Air Force is uniquely equipped to intervene.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Because the jammer is a terrestrial target, the Air Force can fly a stealth bomber over the adversary's airspace and destroy the jammer with a precision-guided munition.
Boom. By striking a ground target, the Air Force restores the link segment, actively protecting and enabling the space domain.
That is the ultimate example of multi-domain operations. Air power restoring space power to enable land power.
It is all interconnected. Now, to supply all of these capabilities to the Army, Navy, and Air Force, the United States Space Force has structured itself into 3 primary field commands.
Right, let's break those down. First is Space Systems Command, located in Los Angeles.
They're the architects of the future. Their job is acquisitions.
Yes, researching cutting-edge technologies, working with commercial partners, and launching the next generation of resilient satellites into orbit.
Once those systems are conceptualized, Space Training and Readiness Command takes over the human element.
They are responsible for writing the operational doctrine, conducting the basic and advanced training for Guardians, and running massive simulated war games.
And these war games are critical, right? Because they force space operators to practice fighting through degraded environments.
Absolutely. They test their tactics against simulated adversaries who are actively jamming and spoofing their networks. They ensure the intellectual superiority of the force.
And finally, we have Combat Forces Command.
They are the operational arm. They take the trained Guardians and the acquired satellite systems and present them to United States Space Command to execute the daily missions.
The sheer volume of coordination required between the Space Force field commands, the service space components, and the combatant commands is staggering.
It is a massive bureaucratic and operational undertaking. To manage that complexity, the United States Army Space Reference Text breaks down the execution into primary space mission areas.
So we must understand exactly what effects the Joint Force is actually delivering.
Right. And the most foundational mission area is space domain awareness.
This is the absolute prerequisite for any operation in space. Space domain awareness is the comprehensive ability to detect, track, identify, and characterize every single object in orbit.
We really have to emphasize how difficult space domain awareness actually is. Space is unimaginably vast.
And objects are moving at 17,000 miles per hour. We're not just tracking active adversary satellites.
No, we are tracking spent rocket boosters, dead satellites from the 1970s, and thousands of pieces of lethal debris.
Right, because if 2 satellites collide, they shatter into thousands of high-velocity fragments.
Which can then hit other satellites, creating a cascading chain reaction of destruction known as the Kessler syndrome.
And if the Kessler syndrome happens, we could effectively lock ourselves out of space for generations because there would be a barrier of shrapnel around the Earth.
It is a nightmare scenario. To prevent this, the military operates the Integrated Space Surveillance Network.
The Integrated Space Surveillance Network is a global web of massive phased array radars and incredibly sensitive optical telescopes scattered across the Earth.
Combined with sensor-carrying satellites already up in orbit, these sensors are constantly scanning the sky, taking massive amounts of observational data, and feeding it into supercomputers to calculate precise orbital trajectories.
They are essentially tracking pieces of metal the size of a softball, moving at hypersonic speeds thousands of miles away.
It's a technological marvel. Without this network, we could not safely launch a rocket, let alone maneuver a satellite to avoid an incoming kinetic kill vehicle.
Okay, so once the domain is mapped and safe navigation is assured, the other mission areas can actually function. We have satellite communications,
Which provides the backbone for both unclassified logistics data and highly secure nuclear command and control networks.
Then we have missile warning and tracking. This mission utilizes constellations of satellites equipped with highly calibrated infrared sensors.
These sensors just stare continuously at the Earth's surface. And the physics of missile warning are incredibly complex.
Because a ballistic missile launch generates a massive thermal signature.
Right, it does. But the Earth is full of thermal signatures. Forest fires, industrial complexes, even solar glint reflecting off the ocean can look like a launch.
So how do they tell the difference?
The infrared sensors and the algorithms processing their data are designed to specifically identify the unique thermal bloom and acceleration profile of a rocket motor.
Oh, so it looks for the specific heat signature of rocket fuel burning.
Exactly. The moment the system characterizes a launch, that data is instantly flashed to terrestrial command centers, providing critical minutes of early warning for theater missile defense batteries to track and intercept the warhead.
Another critical mission area is intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. This is where we pull optical imagery, synthetic aperture radar data, and signals intelligence from orbit.
And synthetic aperture radar is incredibly valuable.
Because unlike a traditional optical camera, it can see through dense cloud cover.
Right, and it can operate in total darkness. It does this by bouncing microwave pulses off the ground and measuring the return signal.
It's basically echolocation with microwaves.
Exactly. Finally, there is environmental monitoring, which is the military application of weather forecasting.
If the Navy is launching aircraft off a carrier, or the Army is planning an airborne drop, they need hyper-accurate meteorological data regarding wind shear, sea states, and storm fronts, all gathered from specialized weather satellites.
The monumental challenge, of course, is prioritizing all of these capabilities. A satellite can only look at one area at a time or process a finite amount of communication bandwidth.
Right. Everyone wants their data first. So to manage this, the Joint Force Space Component Commander utilizes rigorous planning cycles, culminating in the creation of joint space orders and space tasking orders.
These tasking orders are essentially the grand choreography of the space domain.
Just like the Air Force uses an air tasking order to schedule every single flight, refueling mission, and bombing run over a 72-hour period, the space tasking order dictates exactly what every satellite and ground station is scheduled to do.
It tells an intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance satellite when to turn its camera on, exactly what coordinates to image, and which ground station to beam that data down to before the satellite passes over the horizon.
But the tasking order is a static plan. And the battlefield is, well, dynamic. It changes minute by minute.
It does. To execute the plan and respond to immediate threats, United States Space Command operates centralized nerve centers, primarily the Combined Space Operations Center and the National Space Defense Center.
Okay, let's look at those. The Combined Space Operations Center is focused on the daily provision of those space services.
Right. They are managing the bandwidth, ensuring the tasking orders are executed, and dealing with anomalies, like a satellite temporarily losing its connection due to solar radiation.
Crucially, the word combined in the name indicates that they work side by side with allied nations.
We don't do this alone. The United States recognizes that securing the space domain requires deep integration with international partners who bring their own sensor networks and satellite capabilities to the coalition.
Conversely, the National Space Defense Center is hyper-focused on the active threat environment.
This center represents a profound structural integration. It places personnel from the Department of Defense right alongside experts from the intelligence community.
Their mandate is to fuse classified intelligence with military sensor data to rapidly detect, characterize, and defend against hostile actions.
If an adversary attempts to blind a satellite with a laser, or maneuvers a co-orbital anti-satellite weapon into an intercept trajectory, the National Space Defense Center coordinates the immediate defensive response to protect the architecture.
And that defensive posture is heavily concentrated on something we touched on earlier with the Air Force, navigation warfare.
Yes, NAVWAR.
The link segment connecting the satellite to the user is the most vulnerable piece of the architecture. Navigation warfare is the relentless, invisible battle taking place within the electromagnetic spectrum.
Delivering space effects is not a guaranteed transaction. We have to fight through interference to ensure our signals reach our receivers.
Because the physics of interference revolve around the signal-to-noise ratio. A satellite signal traveling 22,000 miles from orbit is incredibly weak by the time it reaches the Earth's surface.
It is often compared to the brightness of a 50-watt light bulb viewed from 1,000 miles away.
That is insane to think about.
It really is, and because the signal is so faint, it is relatively easy for an adversary to deploy a terrestrial jammer that broadcasts a loud, localized static noise on the exact same radio frequency.
The ground receiver is just overwhelmed by the noise and loses the lock on the satellite signal.
And jamming is just the brute force method. Spoofing is far more insidious.
Spoofing terrifies me, honestly. Instead of just blasting white noise to drown out the signal, a spoofer broadcasts a mathematically perfect, counterfeit, global positioning system signal.
Right, a fake signal.
The receiver on an Army Humvee or a Navy destroyer locks onto the counterfeit signal, believing it is authentic.
And then the spoofer slowly alters the timing data, tricking the receiver's navigation system into calculating a false geographical location.
The troops on the ground might think they're driving safely down a designated route, while the spoof's coordinates are actually leading them directly into an ambush or a minefield.
Defeating these tactics requires highly advanced, jam-resistant encrypted receivers, directional antennas that physically block signals coming from the horizon, and constant vigilance from the National Space Defense Center to locate and neutralize the source of the interference.
This really brings the entire architectural design into focus. Every organizational layer we have analyzed exists to solve these specific physical and tactical problems. The United States Space Force recruits and trains Guardians to understand the physics of spoofing and orbital mechanics. Space Systems Command acquires the hardened, jam-resistant satellites. The Joint Integrated Space Teams embed with terrestrial commanders to understand their specific vulnerabilities.
And United States Space Command orchestrates the entire apparatus, utilizing the Integrated Space Surveillance Network and the National Space Defense Center to ensure those critical signals cut through the fog of war.
When you step back and look at the whole picture, the sheer scale of the coordination is staggering. We transitioned from an era where space was an afterthought managed by a few specialized units to a reality where the United States Space Force and United States Space Command form a unified, dedicated warfighting enterprise.
But as we have explored, they do not fight alone. Delivering critical effects requires a massive joint effort.
The Army Space and Missile Defense Command, Navy Space Command, the Marine Corps, and the Air Force are all actively contributing sensors, defending ground links, and integrating orbital data into their tactical maneuvers. They take the strategic theories of space superiority and turn them into actionable reality on the battlefield.
The architecture is vast, highly technical, and operates continuously behind the scenes. It requires a mastery of physics, international law, and joint military doctrine to maintain the fragile stability of the domain.
And the reason you, the listener, need to understand this architecture is because you are unknowingly reliant on it every single hour of the day.
Yes, you really are.
You might not be a military commander requesting synthetic aperture radar imagery of a hostile coastline, but the civilian infrastructure that governs modern life is inextricably tethered to the exact same space domain.
Think about your daily life.
When you swipe a credit card at the grocery store, that financial transaction is synchronized by the timing signals from military satellites.
When you check the weather to see if a hurricane is forming, you are relying on environmental monitoring data.
The global civilian economy and the military apparatus share the exact same invisible high ground, meaning the military organizations we dissected today are actively protecting the foundation of modern society.
Which leaves us with a critical forward-looking question to consider.
I love a good hypothetical.
Today, we focused entirely on military doctrine and military organizations. However, the space domain is currently undergoing a massive commercial revolution.
Right, private companies.
Private companies are launching mega constellations comprised of thousands of small, proliferated satellites to provide global internet and communication networks.
And the sheer volume of these commercial systems dwarfs traditional military constellations.
Exactly. So as we look toward the future of armed conflict, a profound strategic dilemma emerges. In the next major conflict, will the military architecture we discussed today be responsible for protecting this massive commercial web?
Or will the sheer resilience and redundancy of commercial space become the primary shield that ensures the military can communicate and fight when their own dedicated systems are under attack.
That dynamic is going to completely rewrite the operational playbooks in the coming decade.
The intersection of privatized infrastructure and military necessity is going to blur the lines of the competition continuum even further.
The domain is evolving at breakneck speed.
And the organizations commanding it will have to adapt just as fast. Keep your eyes on the sky. Keep questioning the systems that run our world, and we will see you on the next deep dive.